Welcome to Midlife Mix.
Am I your first Canadian podcast?
Oh my God. And they say you always remember your first.
Both things can be true.
He's cheating on you. He's busting up your barbershop.
Welcome, Dee Dee Moore, to Midlife Mix. I'm so happy that you're here.
Oh, thank you so much. I'm happy to be here and to get to talk to you a little bit more.
Yeah. So you have a website called More Than Grand, which is geared to grandparents.
Yes.
But what inspired you to start More Than Grand?
So when I became a grandparent and I looked for information for new grandparents, there really was not a website out there that had information on how to partner with parents and how to really support them as they became parents so that you could connect with your grandchildren. So I decided to start one. I had been a military spouse and I had spent a lot of years having to just make things when I couldn't find what I needed. And so I decided this was something that would be useful to other people.
So what particular points of view or factors or need did you see in the grandparent space that wasn't being addressed before More Than Grand?
There is a big disconnect between what parents want from grandparents and what parents need in the way of support and what grandparents come in excited about. So your average person becomes a grandparent and they are so excited about that baby and they are so excited about their role as a grandparent, and they kind of forget that they're still a parent and those parents still need their support and they still need to grow as a parent. They need you to step back a little bit with your enthusiasm and figure out what you can do that can really help them. There are a lot of, if you go on parent forums, there are a lot of parents who are cutting grandparents off completely because grandparents don't understand the importance of boundaries. And today's new parents have a lot of information that we didn't have. They have an incredible amount of 24/7 access to information about any aspect of raising a baby, raising a child. We didn't have that. And so grandparents don't recognize how much parents are dealing with as far as information overload and struggling with their new role, trying to figure out how to do things right. And so that can really cause some tension between parents and grandparents.
Did your decision to start More Than Grand reflect, your past with your own grandparents? Like, what kind of relationship did you have with your grandparents growing up?
So we never lived near my grandparents. So, back in those days, we would see them a couple times a year, if that. So they were wonderful people who would, I would see for a week or two and that was it. It was a different time. Now a long distance grandparent can be asking for information daily, right? You can try to FaceTime with that grandbaby every single day. And that's something that's very different and puts a lot of stress on new parents, quite honestly. It's something that you need to navigate. I think, when I was growing up, and certainly when I had my children also, grandparents were figures that were a little bit removed because of geographic location in the case of our family. Other families dealt with, had grandparents that were there and very active in their lives. And that still happens today, but the tools that we have and the way that parents are looking at how they should be parenting have changed a lot, and grandparents aren't necessarily prepared for that.
So when you became a grandparent yourself, what were some of the biggest questions you found yourself asking?
I was really, I think one of them was definitely that how to have that strong bond, because my son and his wife lived far away from us. How do I get engaged with this baby that I'm not going to see very often? How can I help them even though I don't live nearby? Those were the kinds of things that I was looking for information on and not finding. There were a lot of websites out there that were for, they may be grandparenting websites, but they were focused on activities. They were focused on, some of them were just kind of a midlife women, geared website that had a few articles on grandparenting, but there really wasn't something that offered resources for new grandparents to start building that strong relationship from the beginning.
How would you describe your grandparenting style?
I like to think I'm very respectful and also very helpful. I know that my daughter-in-law has actually she wrote me the loveliest letter after their second baby came, thanking me for all of the things that I did. I like to help people, and I especially like to support my kids as they deal with life. And so being parents is just another thing that they're tackling, and I like to be in there. Now, I am not the grandparent that comes and sits on the floor and plays with you nonstop. That's going to have to be someone else. I will come and sit and read you stories all day long, but and that's a way that I have connected with my grandchildren from a distance. I FaceTime with them. It's less often nowadays that they're all in school, but I used to FaceTime almost every single day at lunchtime. They would be eating their lunch and I would be reading them stories.
So you only have the one son who has children, correct?
Yes, yes.
Okay. So is it possible for a grandparent to have different grandparenting styles with different groups of grandchildren? So let's say all four of your children had kids, right? We know as parents and as adults and as children that everybody has a different dynamic and a different relationship. So you might have, let's say, different relationship with your son than you would your daughter and vice versa. So is it possible for one's grandparenting style to change depending on the dynamic they have with the parent in question?
Oh, I would think so. Absolutely. As you said, I don't have that experience yet, but you certainly have different relationships with your kids. And as a parent that you have to parent each child a little bit differently, right? This one reacts really well to this, but don't do that with this one because that's just going to, backfire on you. So it's definitely true with grandchildren as well. There are going to be parents that welcome you more fully into their lives, and there are going to be ones that don't. And there's always a big difference between the relationship that a mother and a mother-in-law have with the mom of the children. That's just natural. The mother and her mother have spent years figuring out how to get along with each other and know what the boundaries of their relationship already are, where the mother-in-law is a new entity most of the time. So that all has to be worked out.
So how do you go about working that out at the beginning when you're first sort of navigating this new role that you're in? Let's say if it's your first grandchild, maybe it's not your first grandchild in the family, but maybe it's your first grandchild with that particular child. Are you just going to go in grandparenting as you did the first child? Or are you kind of going to go trial and error, be like, you know what, my daughter actually, I know she's not going to like this, so I'm not going to do that, or vice versa?
The key is to talk to them. Ask that. I have a guide called New Grandparent Essentials that has a list of questions to ask new parents. And by establishing that you want to have that communication, that you want to know what it is they want from you as far as a grandparenting relationship, ask those. Say, look, my ideal relationship with your kids would be if I could do this, right? If I could take them, if I could go to all their baseball games and be the one to take them in the summer for a week and things like that. What does it look like to you? What does the ideal grandparent look like to you? Because you need to be able to communicate those things, communicate your expectations, because we all know what happens when you have expectations that the other person isn't aware of. There's no way to meet those. And sometimes your expectations are unrealistic. So you need to know, it's better to find that out right up front. I use religion as one example of that. A lot of grandparents, when they look at what's really important to them and what they want to pass to their grandchildren, it's often their faith, right? That doesn't work for every parent. Sometimes they have a different faith. Sometimes they don't want to raise their child with any faith at all to begin with, right? They want their child to be able to make a decision as they grow older. That's a conversation that needs to be had, because that one can really lead to some really difficult situations down the line if parents and grandparents are not on the same page about it.
So, but yes, I agree. And I've lived that. My in-laws, or one of my in-laws, he's a devout Catholic, And growing up with my son, and they were sort of, we don't live in the same city, so we only saw them a few times a year. Growing up, with my son, they'd be like, "Oh, you have to go to church with grandpa." And, my son was probably like 2 or 3 at the time. And I said, "Absolutely not." And they're like, "Well, what? What do you mean?" And I'm like, he'll go when he can understand what he's listening to and what he's learning. And they respected that. They didn't ask me before they brought it up in front of him. So how do you navigate that when you have, listen, we know this with grandparents, okay? Like they have the best intentions, but sometimes they think they know everything and they think they know what's best. So when you're dealing with a grandparent like that, how do you navigate like that situation when you're talking about religion in particular?
As a parent, it's difficult, but you have to, and that's why I try to, why I try to address the grandparents, right, and get them to understand the importance of these conversations. As a parent, you have to make it clear you are in charge of your child, right? You're the one that has the responsibility and you need your parents' respect of your role, right? It is a difficult conversation. I've got, at least 2 blog posts on my website about how to have those difficult conversations, because you've got to come together and recognize that you have the same goal. Grandparents and parents really do have the same goal. They want what's best for that child. They may not always think that that's the same thing, and that's when it's parents get to decide which of those things is going to fly. But being able to have an open conversation about anything starts with establishing early on that respectful conversation is possible.
So one of the central ideas of your platform is intentional grandparenting. What do you mean by intentional grandparenting?
It means thinking about what you want for your grandchild, what you want for your relationship with your grandchild, and then thinking about how to get that. A lot of grandparents will say that they want to pass on their values. They want to instill a love of music. They want to, share their hobbies. But then they don't really act in ways that support that, right? They're buying tons of gifts. They're coming in and just trying to be the fun grandparent, when if they step back and look at it, that's not really what's important to them. And that isn't what forms a relationship. So the idea of thinking ahead of time, what do I want? What do I want my grandchild to remember about me someday? And then working backwards from that.
So there's a saying that goes that being a grandparent allows you to be the parent you should have been the first time around, but maybe you just couldn't. What do you think of that?
I think that's ridiculous. I think that being a parent and being a grandparent are 2 entirely different things. And the role of grandparent is not about parenting at all, except for parenting your adult child in ways that are appropriate. As a grandparent, you're not in charge. You're not doing the same things that a parent does. Of course, there's an exception if you are actively raising your grandchildren, which a lot of grandparents find themselves doing, or if you're involved in, regular sustained childcare. In that case, there is a bit more parenting involved there. I think what it does allow you to do, though, is enjoy children in a way that you couldn't as a parent. It allows you to really, you don't have to worry about those responsibilities that you did as a parent. You don't have to worry about making sure the nutrition is optimized at all times and that the discipline is what you want it to be. You just have to enjoy the interactions with the child, which as a parent you can do, but you have a whole lot of other responsibilities as well.
So you kind of touched upon this before, and this is a total stereotype. I recognize it as I'm about to say it. But we often hear that the mom side of the family always has the better grandparents. Why do you think this is? And if you're on the dad's side, what can you do to level up?
Yeah.
Speaking from the mom of a son.
So it is true. I mean, there are studies that show that the maternal grandmother especially has an advantage in the relationship with the grandchildren. And as you said, I touched on it a little bit before. By the time you become a mother, you have had, 20, 30 years of figuring out the relationship with your own mother. And so it's easier to get along with her. You know what to expect. You know where her hot buttons are and she knows where yours are. So it's a much easier relationship to navigate. There's not so much guesswork. Now with a mother-in-law and for you as the mother of a son, the the key to overcoming that advantage that the maternal grandparent has is really getting to know your daughter-in-law and really making it clear to her that you want to know her as a person, that you respect her both as a person and as a parent, and that you don't try to get in the way of her relationship with your son, right? That you aren't still trying to be the most important woman in his life, which a lot of grandmothers do, which is unfortunate because you're not. You just have to accept the fact that it's time for you to take a back seat and let him move on and be the dad and the husband that he should be.
So I would think that conversation would start years before you become a grandparent.
Absolutely, absolutely. And if you've gotten to the point of about to become a grandparent, or you are a grandparent and you haven't worked on that relationship, then it's not too late, but you're going to have to do some catch-up work because you're going to have to prove that you're not just doing this for the baby, right? You're not just doing it to get access to the grandchild. You're doing it because you've realized, wait a minute, I've missed an opportunity here.
So what are some examples then? Like you tell us, well, we have to get to know our daughter-in-law, our future daughter-in-law, to show that we care about her as a person, just as much as we care about her as the mother of our grandchild. So what are some specific examples can somebody do to reach out? Because maybe they haven't had that conversation before the baby came around and they want to start sort of forming that relationship now. What are some examples of things that they can do or say that will help?
Think of it as almost, what would you do with a new friend? How would you establish a relationship with someone that you met and you wanted to get to know better? You'd invite them for coffee. You'd call them and ask them questions. You would show interest in what they're doing and what you might have in common, or ask their opinion about things that they may have a different opinion about, and have conversations that aren't judgmental, right? And just really, there's a book called The Essential Questions, which is designed for gathering information about your older relatives while they're still around, right? It's questions about their childhood, about, what kind of house they lived in when they were young, schooling, which teachers they liked and why. The questions it has in it are really great for any relationship that you want to nurture. So I often recommend that to people. But you can find lists of questions online for getting to know somebody and connecting with them. There are specific questions that you can ask that automatically form a connection. And that's the only way to do it is to talk.
So we know that there are different kinds of grandparents. Some are very active. They retire. Some actually live in the home. They become caregivers. Then there are the grandparents that you might only see, on the holidays. And then there's some that are not involved at all. So what happens when your style of grandparenting doesn't meet the expectations of what your children want or expected you to be?
Well, and that's again, you have to, if you haven't had that conversation, somebody's going to be disappointed, right? I think it's hard for parents to recognize the difference in today's grandparents. When I see this a lot online that, well, when I was a kid, my parents would just drop us off at grandma's for a week in the summer, and they won't even babysit for me now. Well, was your grandmother, had she just retired from a 40-year career as the principal of a school? Was she, or had she been a stay-at-home mom, which was far more likely? Grandparents today, most of the grandmothers have worked or are still working, and were more active than previous generations at our age. Also, a lot of us are still caring for our aging parents, right? We have parents that even if we aren't providing daily care for, we are worrying about. We're trying to help them navigate the health care system or their finances. So we've got a lot more responsibilities now than a grandparent did 30, 40 years ago.
So how can that affect, or how does that affect your relationship with your adult children if they just assumed you would be the grandparent that they had, right? So just as you're saying, right? So they're, even if it's their maternal grandparent was a stay-at-home mom and they did drop her off or drop us off at their house for weeks at a time, or we spent summers with them or weekends with them. And now that they have a kid, they think you're just going to sort of fall into that role, but that's not the case. And then what does that do with your relationship?
Well, it can be hard. And again, the only solution is communication, right? You have to make it, you have to establish that you can have conversations about things like that, right? So many relationships are fractured or become filled with tension because people just don't talk about the important things. And in every relationship, communication is the most important thing. If you want to continue to have a good relationship with your parents, or your adult children, no matter which side of the equation you're on, you have to communicate and you have to be willing to listen to what they have to say. So
So
if you're a parent struggling with that, ask them, right? Ask for their perspective and find out what it is they're dealing with that's making them not meet your expectations.
is this a conversation again that should happen before they even get pregnant? And be like, hey, mom, I'm thinking of having a baby. If I do, what role do you see yourself in when it comes to helping with the child, being around, not being
Absolutely.
around?
Absolutely, that conversation should happen before then, ideally, right? And for grandparents too, if your son is getting married and you think there might be babies on the horizon in the next few years, talk about that. Hey, I'm excited. I've already begun thinking. I know you guys haven't started talking about kids, but I've already started thinking about being a grandparent and what would that look like for you if you have kids? What sort of involvement would you imagine?
So you mentioned that you're long distance with your grandchild. So what is your best advice for long distance grandparents who want to stay close to their grandkids?
There are so many things that we can do now thanks to technology. I mean, we have all been so lucky to have the video chat capability that we have compared to grandparents even 10 years ago, right? And so there are two important things. One is it's even more important to be intentional when you're a long distance grandparent because it's very easy to not spend time nurturing that relationship when you're at a distance. There are lots of things you can do, writing letters, sending little notes, using the Marco Polo app to send messages, beyond FaceTime, right? Which is, of course, the easiest and most accessible. You have to work with parents, though, and it's not easy for them to capture a 2-year-old to come talk to grandma. So you have to find a time that works for parents and a routine that works so that you are making that connection. But I think the main thing is really figuring out how you want that relationship to look down the line and being intentional about it. I mean, I recommend to grandparents, write on your calendar on the 5th of every month that you're going to send a letter, right? And the kids love that. They absolutely adore getting mail more than anything. And that's a great way to share your stories and your values and ask questions, find out more about them so that when you do see them, you have information that helps you connect with them.
We know that parenting philosophies have shifted dramatically in the past 20 years or so. How can grandparents honor their own experiences while still supporting the values of their adult children?
So I think that it's really important for today's grandparents to recognize that while the wisdom they have is incredibly valuable, parents are probably not interested in it. They have so many sources of information, and it's really hard for a grandparent to come in and start making recommendations to a parent who has already gotten an idea of how they want to do things from, email newsletters, their pediatrician, and, 25 social media accounts. So for grandparents, you have to focus on what your role is and recognize that the parenting part of it, the parenting philosophy part of it, is something you have now passed on to the next generation, right? You have to consider your role as what you can bring to a child's life, and that's not going to necessarily be involved with that parenting part of it.
What about, and I know this is probably the case in a lot of households that maybe a lot of people don't want to talk about. What do you do if you hate your child's spouse in the way that they parent? Because you can have all the conversations in the world, but when you talk about real life experiences and you're seeing like maybe your daughter-in-law, your son-in-law is more rough with their grandchildren than you would have been, or you don't like the way they talk to them, or you don't like their rules. How do you navigate that?
That is when you bite your tongue and you go complain to your best friend because there's nothing you can do about it. And you can't, your options are so limited. You don't want to cause stress in their marriage. I mean, if it's your daughter-in-law that's acting that way, you can't go to your son and say, you need to control your wife, right? You need to change what she's doing. That's not going to work. So yeah, unfortunately, that's when you really have to just step back. It may mean limiting your interactions until the child's a little bit older and that phase that's causing these behaviors has passed. Um, Seek professional advice because sometimes a good therapist can give you strategies for dealing with situations like that. But yeah, it's a tough one, and you're right, it happens.
So you shouldn't bring it up at all.
I would really tread carefully about bringing that one up. Yeah, I would consult a professional before bringing it up, quite honestly, because yeah, it's tough.
And I'm guessing if you did bring it up and it didn't go over well, it could have some serious repercussions for your relationship with your own child.
Exactly, exactly. Yeah.
That's a tough one.
It is a tough one. It is a tough one. That's when it's really good to have a best friend or a partner that you can release those tensions with because you really can't get in between another person's relationship, and that includes between a parent and their child.
So what is your advice for handling conflicts between grandparents and parents over different approaches to parenting?
Yeah, I just again, I think grandparents just need to stay out of that. The approach to parenting that your child is choosing that's their right. That's what they are supposed to be doing, and you need to recognize that you aren't involved in those decisions anymore. I recommend finding out more about their approach. For example, I know there's the whole positive parenting, gentle parenting approach, which is sometimes different from what we did as parents. But if you go read the books that they're reading or follow the creators on Instagram that they're following, you're going to find out there are actually a lot of similarities between that and what you did as a parent. Or you'll learn more about why that's important, and you may recognize that, hey, that actually makes a lot of sense, and I kind of wish I'd known that when I was a parent.
You have a post on your social media about how grandparents shouldn't teach their grandchildren about deception. In other words, don't pull here's a chocolate right before dinner. Don't tell your mother. Why?
Exactly. Because you should never teach a child to lie to their parents. They need to have an unwavering trust that they can tell their parents anything. A lot of bad things happen in a child, can happen in a child's life. You want to know that they're going to be able to tell their parents when they're at a party and their ride is drinking, right? They don't want to know that you want them to be able to go to their parents. If a teacher is teaching them cruelly, you want them to be able to go to their parents if a child predator approaches them and says, don't tell mom or something bad will happen. They need to know that you are on their side and they can tell you anything. And if you, as a grandparent, are suggesting that there are things that they shouldn't tell their parents, that's just not something you want to teach as a grandparent. And I'll admit it, it's hard not to. I've said it. I've said, "Oh, okay, I'll let you do it, but don't tell your mom." And immediately said, "No, just kidding. You can tell her," because I realized that those words came out of my mouth, right? But it's an important lesson to. It's an important thing not to teach your grandchildren.
What about if it's the other way around? So, like, what if your grandchild comes to you with a secret and says, "Don't tell mom"?
That's a tricky one.
Right?
Yes. Oh my goodness. I don't know if I can come up with a great answer off the cuff, but I think my reaction would be, imagine if it were another child coming to you with that situation, right? Imagine if it were another child that came to you and said, "I don't want to tell my parents this, but I trust you, so I'm going to tell you." If it's something that you felt like you could not tell their parent about, if it weren't a question of safety or, betraying their trust wouldn't cause, bad repercussions for them, then, that's a good litmus test for whether you should talk to parents about it. Because it is really important for a child to have a safe adult. And if they want to trust you with something that they don't want to trust their parent with, and it's not something that it is really going to cause trouble or a safety issue, then there's something pretty nice about being that confidant.
Yeah, I think if you can be, like you said, that safe adult to your grandchildren, and like you said, as long as there's not a safety element to it, I think
Right.
that's what fosters those close relationships between a grandparent and a grandson or a granddaughter.
Absolutely.
Because if they feel they can come to you and share with you, maybe just even to help them make a decision about something that they're not ready to come to with their mom or their dad,
Right.
right?
Right.
It really does foster those closeness. And if they don't feel safe with you and that you're just going to rat them out to, their mother or their father, they're not going to come to you with those things. And that's kind of,
Exactly.
can have a negative impact on that relationship as well.
Right. Right.
We're talking about modern families. We know that divorce is a real thing. Blended parenting is a real thing. So how can grandparents be a stabilizing force in families when they are going through transitions like divorce or blended parenting?
Absolutely. That's a great question. And grandparents can be such a stabilizing factor for children. So I think that I actually have a blog post on my website about, how to help your adult children and grandchildren through a divorce. The main things to remember are, don't try to get into the relationship that's crumbling. Don't try to diagnose what's wrong or put blame anywhere. Be there to support your adult child. Let the other parent know, if it's a situation that you can, that you still want to support them. I mean, in many cases, that can be really, really helpful for the children, the grandchildren, if they know that you can pick them up whether they're at mom's house or at dad's house, right? So let both parents know that your main focus right now is being there for your child and your grandchildren, and you want to help support them in any way you can. For the grandchildren, showing up, being there, providing that space for them, and continuing what you've been doing so that feels like a safe and secure relationship can be incredibly helpful.
What about when you become a step grandparent? So let's say, your daughter marries a man who already has 3 kids.
Yeah.
How do you navigate your place in that family?
That's a good one, because it's you have to take the cue from the kids. You really do. And If you come in, if you, for example, I've heard this before that, oh my gosh, I have grandchildren now. Like, I am so excited I have grandchildren now. And you can come in way too strong if you want to be this new grandparent in their lives. And they've already got grandparents that they've known for years and years. They're going to see you as different. So you have to nurture that relationship, take your cues from them, and take your cues from the parents also. How involved do they want you to be? That's one aspect of it. The other aspect is if you already have grandchildren and now you have three more, especially depending on their ages, because if they're already teenagers, it may be different. But if they're young, make sure you're treating them the same way you're treating your grandchildren, right? When Christmas rolls around and you buy gifts for your grandchildren, you buy gifts for those step grandchildren as well. Kids are going to notice the things that are done differently, and it's really important that you don't make them feel like they're less because they entered the family later.
Kids notice, but so do parents. So
Yeah.
in that in that situation, let's say it's your daughter marrying a man with, three other kids. If you're lavishing gifts to her biological children, but maybe you're skimping out on the stepkids, that's going to have an effect on your relationship with her as well.
Absolutely. Yeah. No, it really does. And playing favorites, sometimes we do it accidentally. Sometimes we do it. I know I had a grandmother write me once and say, "What do I do? I always, when I'm out shopping, I see little things that I want to buy my granddaughter, and I never really see anything for my grandson. He's older, so like, is it okay to just get her things and then maybe give him $10?" And it's like, well, how about not getting her things, right? Like, if you seriously don't know your grandson well enough to think of something that he would appreciate, then you need to work on that relationship instead of, you know, making him feel like he's not as important.
I want to end this conversation with just a little bit of fire round. And I want your top tips on what three things a grandparent should always do, and three things a grandparent should never do.
Okay, so three things a grandparent should always do is number one is listen, and that's to your children and your grandchildren. Respect parents' authority and remember that they are the ones in charge of this child, and focus on engaging with your grandchild instead of buying them things. Those would be my three that they should. Three they shouldn't do. Oh my goodness. Well, let's start with the one we already talked about, which is don't tell your children to lie to their parents, right? That's just a really big one. Don't buy into the idea that grandchildren are for spoiling, because that is really not what they're there for. And let's see. Don't treat it as a second chance at parenting, right? It's an entirely new role. So those would be the three that I think get a lot of grandparents in trouble.
Very true. Well, thank you so much, Dee Dee, for taking the time to sit with me and talk with me. I learned a lot, and when it comes my time to be a grandparent, I'll be a little bit more prepared, but I'm hoping that time is very far down the road. For more information, if anybody wants to check you out, where should they go?
They should go to morethangrand.com, and or you can find me on social media. I'm on Facebook, Instagram, Pinterest, TikTok at morethangrand. So love to see you.
Awesome. Thank you.
Thanks so much.